Please become a patron of Myth Vision Podcast. Get access to everything early. Help us grow. Ian Mills, New Testament Review Podcast. Thanks for joining me again today here on Myth Vision, brother.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it. We have so many questions we're going to get into today. I figured let's start with the ending of Mark.
Yes.
You really have a lot to say about this topic.
It's one of my favorite topics. It's a fascinating thing that most people have some familiarity with, at least if they're familiar with the New Testament. But there's a whole world there to unpack. So, Mark, the second gospel in the New Testament, the oldest surviving gospel, ends without any appearances of the risen Lord. It ends with the women are afraid and they run away and tell no one. And the last line is for they were afraid. It actually ends with the word for in Greek, the word gar. They ran away and told no one for they were afraid. Fascinating ending. Jesus is resurrected. We get the angels telling the women this. Jesus prophesies this earlier in the gospel that he would be raised, but there's no actual description of that. And this, of course, troubled Christians. Matthew and Luke, of course, provide, when they are rewriting the Gospel of Mark, provide these resurrection accounts. Scribes also supplied resurrection accounts, new resurrection accounts, to the end of Mark's Gospel. And depending on how you count these, there's four different endings to Mark's Gospel, in addition to 16:8, where the oldest manuscripts end. So,
how different are those differences?
It depends. So there's a range here. So the oldest manuscripts, Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, they end with just they ran away for they were afraid. Then we get what's called the shorter ending. So that's the shortest ending, the short ending, the original ending. Then we get the shorter ending. And this is, they went off and told everyone immediately, which is really, really funny, appended directly to 16:8. They told no one for they were afraid. They went off and told Peter immediately. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And some people spotted that. And so this is sort of ending 1b. And in Codex Bobiensis, our oldest Latin copy of the Gospel of Mark, takes out 16:8. So there isn't this running away for they were afraid. They just immediately go telling everyone. And that actually makes sense. That works as an ending to Mark's Gospel, right? So we've got those two. We've got the shortest ending, the shorter ending, and the shorter ending adjusted to actually fit with Mark's Gospel, right? Then we get the longer ending. And this is one that if you've read the King James Bible or you look at this long section at the end of your New International Version, it's in italics. There's this extra several verses, 12 extra verses. And it reads like a sort of precky or adaptation or abbreviation or summary of the resurrection accounts from other Gospels. So we have two people walking on a road and Jesus appears to them, just like Luke in the road to Emmaus. We have Jesus appearing to a series of women. There's a series of 3 short stories, and then Jesus sends the disciples off, gives a sort of commission to the disciples. And this is partially famous because this is where Jesus tells the disciples they should drink poison and handle snakes. And so the Appalachian snake handling churches, this is their verse. They are often King James onlyists or some sort of Textus Receptus. They believe that this longer form of Mark was original. And that is what lies at the basis of their snake handling practices, right? And then there's my favorite ending. And this is the one that is probably least well known. Codex Washingtoniensis is a manuscript of the New Testament, a Greek manuscript of the New Testament, that's kept in Washington, D.C., which is why it has that terrible name, in the Freer collection. And there is something in it called the Freerlogion, which is named after this collection it's found in. And this is Mark 16:8, plus the longer ending, those extra 12 verses with the snake handling and the retelling of Emmaus, but an extra chunk put in there in which Jesus asks the disciples, why are you so thick? Why aren't you getting this? Why are you disbelieving? And they answer, and they explain to him, it's because of the devil. The devil is the reason we failed to understand what's going on here. He's the reason we don't believe. And Jesus says, well, I took care of that. The devil is taken care of. Now you should believe. And so we get an explanation. We not only get the resurrection appearances of Jesus, but we get an explanation for this theme that lots of scholars and people in antiquity as well noticed about the Gospel of Mark. The disciples in Mark are dense, and they just don't get it. And that's true to a lesser degree of the other Gospels. Some of the Gospels give a slightly more positive portrayal of the disciples. But in Mark especially, there is this sort of constant negative portrayal of the disciples. And we have, the Epistle of Barnabas, the 2nd century text, which comments on that. And Barnabas just says, it's just because they were like ordinary folk. They were simpletons, and that's fine. But the Philologion gives a better answer or not a better answer, gives a different answer for why the disciples are so thick in the Gospel of Mark. It's Satan.
Yeah, I've heard that one before.
Yeah. The one other thing to note about the Philologion is it's not only known from this one Greek manuscript, which is now stored in DC. Jerome knows this. Jerome, the 4th century translator of the Latin Vulgate, famous early Christian Bible scholar, quotes a chunk of the Philologion and says he knows this to be in manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark. So this is a very old extra story about Jesus and the disciples that is in one surviving Bible and was apparently in more.
This is quite interesting. I mean, what that tells me is not only were they solving a problem, I don't blame them, especially when you start to orthodox your beliefs into a cohesive teaching, like we talk about the diatessaron and stuff. Tatian. Sorry. I think it's interesting, too, how early that idea is. And I guess I want to ask you maybe a question probing something. This is kind of theological, maybe, but it also makes you kind of wonder where Mark is picking up this, you dim-witted disciples. I've heard lots of people say Mark's using Paul.
Sure.
Paul doesn't always seem to think the apostles are the brightest or like they're the best. Oh, you super apostles.
Yeah.
Could this be, and I know there's no we know it is, but do you suspect maybe that could be an answer for why they're so dim-witted in the earliest known gospel we have?
There's a famous scholar who argues this case. Whedon argued that the Gospel of Mark is being written by a Pauline Christian against the 12 disciples, that they're the villains of the story.
Ooh.
And while that's,
overboard.
Interesting, yeah, there's actually a lot to say that that's not the case. Jesus tells the disciples that ultimately, he says they're going to make mistakes, they're going to deny him, but he says ultimately he will meet them in Galilee, and ultimately they will receive the same crown of martyrdom as he will. So Jesus foretells the disciples ultimately are going to come around and be faithful and live. They're going to ultimately be faithful to Jesus. So I don't think it's a plausible reading of the Gospel of Mark to say that the disciples are actually the villains. It's probably doing some other work. It's probably, the Barnabas interpretation, that these are just portraying the everyman. I think there's probably something to that the disciples are in places sort of the proxy for us, are sort of...
Or the reader.
Yeah,
maybe.
Exactly.
But the reader gets the sneak peek also to see the answer to the dim-witted.
Right. And Mark has empathy for the struggle to believe. It is the Gospel of Mark where we first find the prayer, Lord, help my unbelief. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. And so it is sympathetic to the plight of the person who is struggling to believe, who wants to believe but has trouble. And I find that very comforting, that the earliest teachings of Jesus are expressing sympathy, and Jesus honors the prayer, Lord, help my unbelief. That is, and so we get the disciples, these followers of Jesus, who we are told ultimately are going to confess, ultimately are going to die for their faith, according to the Gospel of Mark. We get them portrayed as people who struggle with unbelief. And I find that, very comforting, and indeed I find that moving.
I've even interviewed with Dr. Robert M. Price, and he says, and he's an atheist, and he's like, look, that is a seriously great statement of anyone, of anything, to say that. It's really deep. But I gotta ask one more in the vein of this, because I've heard people try to say that ending of Mark is actually found in the Gospel of John, that its original ending was somewhere in John. Quick question, I guess, to ask would be, do you honestly think the original did get cut off and they added what was going on?
I see. So some people have proposed that there was... So Mark 16:8, there is a proposal that Mark 16:8 wasn't the original ending of Mark.
Right.
That what we find in our oldest manuscripts is actually a fragment, that the rest of Mark, the ending of Mark, has been broken off, has been lost. And then scribes come along later and add these other endings to fix that. But that the version that ends at 16:8, they ran away for they were afraid, is not the original ending. And the scholars who argue this have often argued that the Gospel of John, or sometimes the Gospel of Matthew, preserves that author's rewriting of what was originally there. So they had a copy of Mark that had the extra ending before it got chopped and lost. I don't think that's likely. I think there's very little reason to believe that. If all of our earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark, including versions, the oldest Syriac version, don't have this ending, it's hard to imagine how. It's of course possible, but it's hard to imagine that this ending, that the Gospel of Mark with this additional ending, actually circulated wide enough for someone like John to get it and rewrite it. It's possible, but also 16:8 makes sense as an ending. I mean, ending with gar, for, the word for, some people have suggested doesn't work, but getting a little technical here, gar is a post-positive. It doesn't come in the word order that English uses the word for in. So it's actually supposed to come after the word that we translated as coming before. And there are other books that end kind of like this. Jonah is a famous example. The book of Jonah ends with, and also many animals. And it's just, they just didn't have the same stylistic sensitivities that we have, perhaps.
Interesting.
I think the Gospel of Mark ends in a beautiful way, the way it is. So,
I guess in the vein of all this, after reading John J. Collins' book, The Apocalyptic Imagination, and he talks about how there's light and darkness, even before creation, that play a role often in the genre. I wonder if that Satan is the reason, blaming Satan or blaming darkness, so to speak, because the Gospels aren't apocalyptic genre in the same way, but they have an eschatological apocalyptic tone to them.
Sure, yep.
Probably because their founder had this tone. I just say that to say, I wonder if they're building off Satan was the reason behind it, because a lot of times the battle between light and darkness is often a thing in these type of genres. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Obviously, the Gospels are not apocalypses in the generic sense of these are the stories about somebody going to heaven and getting a vision and coming back. But I think they very much fit into apocalyptic in a number of important ways. These are Jesus revealing knowledge, revealing teaching to his followers, which is Jesus is for the gospel writers revealing God's truth to the disciples. And that is the definition of apocalypse, right? That is the unveiling of a truth, the unveiling of knowledge, of information. And it also fits into the apocalyptic dark versus light worldview, like you mentioned. Jesus is having constant conflicts with unclean spirits in the Gospel of Mark, with demons, with Satan in the Gospel of Luke. There is this conflict between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. And John, of course, is the best example of this. In fact, John has often been described as a repudiation of Second Temple apocalyptic literature, or possibly Gnostic apocalyptic literature, depending on how you want to situate it. Because in the Gospel of John, Jesus says things like, no one has gone up to heaven to see these things except for the one who's come down, namely myself. He is explicitly contrasting himself with people who've claimed to have apocalyptic visions. And he says, you don't find truth through visions. You don't find truth, he even says in John 5, you don't find truth just in the books of Moses. Although he doesn't say the books of Moses are bad, he says they testify about me, but he says you don't find truth anywhere else but me. I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. And these visions, these purely scriptural exegesis things, those things, going to them for truth is the wrong thing to do. You should come to me. And so it's placing himself as the source of all truth explicitly in contradiction to, in this case, apocalypses, which is fascinating. So it is itself a kind of, apocalypse.
Wow.
Although telling the story of the earthly life of Jesus.
Wow, this is interesting. There's so many questions I have. Thank you.
Yeah.